I've been playing League of Legends ever since late Season 5, so while I haven't experienced much of the glory days as they say, I've been around for a long time, and I got to see the game evolve and change for better or worse countless times. During the latter half of the game, we've had no shortage of interesting champions, both new ones and reworks, and I thought it would be worthwhile to talk about which ones, in my opinion, are Riot's creme de la creme, or in other words, let's talk about the best designed champions in the game. Before we begin, I'd like to lay down some ground rules. The statistics of a champion will not be taken into consideration because those can be adjusted at a moment's notice, and generally speaking, if they're too strong, they'll be nerfed, or if they're too weak, they will be buffed. That's how the game's balance works. If you'd like a little more context on what I mean by that, I suggest you watch my video on what makes a well-designed champion before watching this one, just so you can get a better idea for what I mean by champion design. TLDR, a champion who's currently strong in the meta is not always well designed, and a champion who is currently weak in the meta is not always poorly designed. One last thing, obviously there's a lot of great champion designs in League. In fact, contrary to popular belief, the number of good characters far exceeds the number of bad. It's going to be difficult to list all of them, so I decided to choose 4 that I think really stand out to me. So let's start off by talking about the number 1 spot. Spoiler alert, you already saw him in the thumbnail, Jhin. And no, I couldn't put him in 4th place just to prove a point that would be disrespectful to him. Exil spared no effort in documenting just how critical a precedent he set for the marksman subclass going forward, creating a 44 minutes and 44 second long video. Yes, that was done intentionally. Jhin is widely respected by almost the entire community for being that one marksman who's not oppressively frustrating to go against, but not someone they can just ignore. He was able to lower the barrier of entry for players who were looking to try their hand at ADC because, unlike the other marksmen who focused on speed, Jhin was all about power. You didn't need to have impeccably tight mechanics to play him well, rather his performance depended on how well you understood his windows of opportunity and made every shot count. Jhin has just as many weaknesses as he does strengths. Every attack hits like a truck, but in exchange he hits really slowly. He has some of the highest combat range of any champion in the game, but they require pinpoint accuracy. Critical strikes give him a large boost of movement speed, but to counter that he has no dashes and they do reduce damage. His lotus traps can output huge damage that far surpasses even Teemo's mushrooms, but they're almost impossible to land on their own without setup. There have been instances where he was perhaps a little overtuned and needed to be knocked down a peg, but hardly anyone views Jhin as a champion who's frustrating to deal with or lacking in counterplay. They were able to execute on this while giving him a unique yet pronounced design. At first, people made the claim that Deadly Flourish was marginally near to Jinx's Zap since they both were a long-range skill shot that had an indicator, and Curtain Call bared a similar likeness to Caitlyn's Ace in the Hole. But those claims were quickly dismissed when looking at his lore and design. In terms of his background, Jhin is a deranged psychopathic serial killer who views murder as an art and tries to destroy his victims in the most fashionable way possible. He also has a weird obsession for the number 4. Everything has to come in 4, which in East Asian culture is an unlucky number because 4 in Chinese also sounds like death. Jin's design team was able to brilliantly replicate his OCD with 4 by making each of his abilities have something with the number 4 in them. His passive has 4 shots, his Q bounces 4 times, W marks a target for 4 seconds, E grants vision of targets for 4 seconds, and his ultimate fires 4 shots. Another key part of his design that I think was so well done is that every single thing Jhin does is discernible. Most people can quickly figure out what he does just by looking at him. There's no absence of clarity in his kit. His auto attacks, Q, W, E, and ultimate are all easy to notice visually and audibly. All in all, he's arguably one of, if not the best designed champions in the game. He's not so insanely broken to deal with, nor is he someone that you should underestimate. Really fun to play and the first AD carry aside from Ezreal to be beginner friendly since you don't need to have fast attack move mechanics, and his gameplay, demeanor, and aesthetic apply perfectly to his lore in the League of Legends universe. So up next, let's talk about a rework champion, Warwick. I made an entire video on which 5 reworks were the best in my opinion, and Warwick was part of the 5. His playstyle revolves around relentlessly chasing down enemies using his innate durability and high movement to shrug off most attempts to hinder his pursuit. True to his nature as a werewolf, Warwick is really good at sniffing out wounded enemies before charging after them to finish the job. When he runs after people, he drops on all 4s like a wolf, but when he attacks, it's almost very similar to a human. Like Jhin, Warwick is a champion with a unique kit armed with a balance of strengths and weaknesses. He has really good tempo, but poor combat mobility, and has a hard time sticking to targets unless he's already on top of them, which means most ranged champions can usually kite him out if they're able to dodge his ultimate. Practically speaking, it's fitting because he has to drop on all fours to run, but he can't attack without his claws, so he has to stand up to attack, which means he doesn't run as fast. You have to choose between either moving or fighting, not both. He's strong in skirmishes due to his durability and sustain, but can struggle to hold down in damage during teamfights where he can't focus on one target and often has to switch to whoever he can easily attack. That lowers his effectiveness since he loses his attack speed bonus. Everything about Warwick is pretty strong. Good damage, good durability, good tempo, good crowd control, good sustain, but they all can be exploited in some way. He's definitely a fearsome threat to go up against, but doesn't feel oppressive to deal with unless he's fed, but all champions are in that case. He's a pretty fair champion, strong when you don't know what he can do, but manageable if you do. In his new lore, he was basically a living test subject for Singed, who used a bunch of crazy alchemy and steroids or something to turn him into this freak of nature. I don't know what's in that stuff, and frankly I don't want to, but I'd imagine that giant tank of chemicals on his back are what gives him the superhuman speed, durability, and regeneration, as evident by his insanely high tempo and the damage reduction he gains from Primal Howl. Thematically, it makes perfect sense. He's this feral, raging monster with high movement speed, incredible resilience to injury and pain, and the ability to heal up any damage he takes. Yet despite his augmentation, his original state still echoes through his appearance. He looks like a werewolf, attacks like a werewolf, runs like a werewolf, and his abilities are made in the way you would expect them to be from a werewolf. This next one I think will upset a lot of people, but I personally think Sylas is a fantastic champion. Please hear me out. Again, I don't judge a champion's design based on how overpowered they are or how broken they were in X patch. This is about gameplay design and how well his lore was implemented into his kit. So let's start with gameplay. Despite being able to steal any ultimate in the game, Sylas actually has a very straightforward kit, like super straightforward. His passive makes his next attack do AoE magic damage whenever using an ability, similar to Riven's passive, which is a Spellblade. Considering a lot of champions these days have passives with a billion lines of text, this is pretty refreshing. Chain Lash does damage in 2 lines with an explosion occurring where chains intersect after a short duration, another very simple ability with nothing particularly overloaded about it. Kingslayer is a dash attack that heals Sylas while damaging enemies, and lastly, Abscond and Abduct is a dash followed by a hook that pulls him towards whoever gets hit by it. Those cut and dry basic abilities were designed that way intentionally, which I'll get into a little bit when I go into his lore. But before that, his ultimate, as you all know, allows him to copy any of the enemy team's ultimates and use them as his own. This might seem overpowered and unfair at first, but it's important to understand that it comes at the cost of Sylas himself not having an ultimate. It's also important to remember that only ultimates that function well in a vacuum are usable by him. For example, he doesn't get much mileage out of Darius's ultimate because he can't apply bleed stacks. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of shenanigans he can pull off with other champions' ultimates, but in the end it's just one ability and only goes as far as whatever the original champion's ultimate is meant to do. In most circumstances, Sylas's copy is a weaker version. Now let's talk about why I think his design is genius. In my video addressing the issue with new champions, I talked about how cleverly they were able to combine the 2 parts of Sylas into his abilities. He's a mage from Demacia. For the uninitiated, Demacia as a country is very anti-magic. They think it's evil, they think it's bad, and should be eradicated. And most of the champions that you see in Demacia, aside from Lux, are all about physical attacks. Fiora, Garen, Jarvan, Lucian, Poppy, Quinn, Vayne, Xinjiao, a lot of head-on attackers. For clarification's sake, just because a champion does magic damage or builds AP doesn't mean they're a mage. Kayle and Morgana are demigods, I believe. Galio is technically an anti-mage, and Sona is, actually I don't know what she is, but she doesn't really use magic from what I know. Her instrument is magical, but I don't think she herself can cast magical spells. She can't throw fireballs or something, trust me on this one. Anyways, Sylas's Demacian background and attitude shows through his attacks. He physically attacks you with his chains just like how Garen smashes you with his big ass sword. But those attacks are all infused with magic to show his background as a mage, so he's half Demacian, half mage in terms of his abilities. His Q explodes with energy, his W uses magic to sort of steal the life from his target, probably the same way he steals the energy signatures of his opponents to copy their ultimate. Sylas is a perfect representation of a Demacian mage because he still has the no-nonsense upfront attitude of his nation, but with a magical touch to show you how he was able to leverage that side of his power. Honestly, they couldn't have done it any better. So on to my last pick, I'm gonna go with Aphelios. I'm gonna go with Zilean. He's considered by many to be the most balanced champion of all time. considering he hasn't received a buff or nerf in over 5 years, a record never held by any other champion before or since. He fits the timekeeper archetype you see in other fantasy games. All of his attacks have some element of time related to them. His passive speeds up the experience rate for his team, Q is literally a time bomb that explodes after a few seconds, W speeds up the cooldown on his Q and E, his E speeds up an ally or slows down an enemy, and finally his ultimate turns back time on a champion who was recently knocked out. His playstyle encourages patience and planning since good Zilean players have to think ahead of time to make the best use of his abilities. Time Bomb does have an instant activation if you land 2 on top of each other, but individually, the bombs take time to detonate. You have to decide whether or not it's more beneficial to speed up your team or slow down the enemy team with Time Warp. And lastly, you have to decide who's the best champion to use Chrono Shift on in a fight, since that can either single-handedly turn it around or be totally meaningless if mistimed or mistargeted. Not the most popular champion given I made a why no one plays about him, but design-wise, he's surprisingly very well crafted for someone who was released way back in 2009 when the game first came out, although they did give him a minor rework in Season 5. Just like how bending time to your will can lead to a myriad of fancy tricks, you can pull off some pretty crafty stuff with his time bomb either by doing a double bomb to stun a target, or tagging your frontline or divers with bombs to rush into the enemy team for follow-up damage. You can use Time Warp to juice up your Hecarim or slow down the enemy Darius and laugh in his face. Despite having pretty much only 2 abilities, Zilean's gameplay never gets monotonous because there's a lot of things you can do with him. None of his abilities are subversive or oppressive in nature. His time bomb shows a clear radius and countdown for when they're about to explode. Chrono Shift can be instantly cast on someone, but if he uses it too early, you can stall out the ultimate before actually finishing the job. Just like Warwick, he has to make a choice between using his abilities to attack or defend, and generally can't do both of them at the same time, which opens up not only the door for counterplay, but for skill expression. Zilean doesn't have the most fleshed backstory relative to some of the newer champions because he comes from a different time, but since his character closely depicts Father Time and the Time Wizard trope, how they were able to model his kit was done very well and fairly. In his lore, he's able to travel throughout time and to alternate timelines but can't do anything to change what already happened, which hints to the limitations of his abilities. I think that's partly the reason why Chrono Shift was made to only be used on someone who's still alive and not an ability where, like, he can instantly respawn a teammate and have them immediately teleport to where they just died. It was a very tasteful way to make him strong in his own right but not too ridiculously overpowered to where it would just be completely stupid to deal with him. Apart from those 4, there are a ton of other good champions I wish I could have talked about with equal parts good gameplay and character design, so I'll at least make an honorable mentions list of champions that I think were very well created. Again, just because you don't see a champion on this list, that doesn't instantly make them bad. Quality of design is a spectrum and not black and white. If you agree or disagree with the ones I've chosen, let me know in the comments down below. Again, what's considered a good champion is subjective. Someone might think Yuumi is the epitome of good gameplay while Jhin is terribly designed. Of course, they're wrong, but you know what I mean. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to see more content like this, consider subbing to the channel. Also check out the description down below for links to my Discord and social media, as well as the playlist containing all of my discussion videos if you want to watch more. That's it for today though, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.